The small restaurant sat on a quiet street, its warm lights flickering through the large front windows. Inside, the air smelled of freshly baked bread and simmering stew. It was the kind of place where regulars were greeted by name, where families gathered for Sunday dinners, and where the hum of casual conversation never faded. The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. His uniform was crisp but slightly wrinkled, his boots scuffed from long days on duty. He was young, mid-20s at most, yet there was a weight in his eyes that made him seem older. Fatigue clung to his features, but he held himself upright, scanning the room before quietly making his way to an empty table near the window. A few heads turned to look at him, but no one spoke. Some offered polite nods, others averted their gaze. The soldier exhaled, resting his hands on the table, his fingers faintly trembling. It had been a long week, training exercises, early mornings, and sleepless nights. All he wanted now was a warm meal and a moment of peace. Behind the counter, Mr. Collins, the owner, stood with a towel slung over his shoulder. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with silver streaks running through his dark hair. His restaurant was his pride, a business he had built with his own hands. He had seen all kinds of customers walk through his doors, but the moment his eyes landed on the soldier, something in his expression shifted. His grip on the towel tightened. The soldier waited patiently, his gaze fixed on the menu chalked up on the wall. A waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated before stepping forward. "Welcome," she said softly, her voice carrying an odd hesitation. "Would you like to order something?" The soldier gave her a small smile. "Yes, please. Just a hot meal. Whatever's good today." She nodded, but as she turned toward the counter, Mr. Collins stopped her with a firm shake of his head. The waitress froze, confusion flickering across her face. The soldier noticed. A strange tension began to settle over the room. Mr. Collins stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We're full," he said shortly. The soldier blinked, he glanced around. Half the tables were empty. I can wait," he offered, his voice calm, polite. Mr. Collins' jaw clenched. "I said we're full." For the first time since stepping inside, the soldier felt something other than exhaustion. He felt the stares of the other customers, the whisper of voices. He wasn't sure why, but something was wrong. And it was about to get worse. A heavy silence filled the restaurant. The soldier could feel it, the way the air had changed, thick with something unspoken. Mr. Collins stood firm behind the counter, his expression set like stone. The waitress hesitated, glancing between the soldier and her boss. Her fingers gripped the notepad tightly, as if she wanted to say something, but knew better. Other employees whispered among themselves near the kitchen door, their voices hushed, wary. The soldier cleared his throat. "I don't mind waiting," he said again, offering a small patient smile. "It's been a long day, sir. I'd just like a meal." Mr. Collins's face darkened. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the counter. His next words were slow, deliberate. "We don't serve people like you here." For a moment the words didn't register. The soldier blinked, confusion washing over him. "Sir?" The room seemed to shrink around him. A few customers glanced his way, but no one spoke up. No one defended him. Mr. Collins exhaled sharply, as if he were holding something back. His voice was colder now, clipped with finality. "I don't serve soldiers in my restaurant. You need to leave." The words struck the soldier like a sudden gust of icy wind. A slow, sinking realization settled in his chest. He wasn't being denied service because the restaurant was full. He wasn't being turned away because of some misunderstanding. He was being rejected because of the uniform on his back. He straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening, but his voice remained steady. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't understand. I've done nothing wrong. I only came here to eat." Mr. Collins' face twitched, something flickering behind his eyes. Anger, resentment, or maybe something deeper. "You heard me, son. Take your business somewhere else." The soldier inhaled sharply, willing himself to stay calm. He had been trained to keep his composure, to withstand worse than this. But the humiliation, the quiet sting of rejection, was something he hadn't been prepared for. His hands curled into fists under the table before he forced them to relax. He searched Mr. Collins's face for an explanation, for something that made sense, but all he saw was hardened resistance. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Why do you hate me for wearing this uniform?" Mr. Collins stiffened. The soldier saw his Adam's apple bob slightly as he swallowed, but his expression remained unchanged. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he muttered. The soldier looked around the restaurant, meeting the eyes of the other diners. Some looked away immediately, pretending not to notice. Others stared, their expressions unreadable. But no one spoke. No one stood up for him. His heart pounded, his face burning with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't far from it either. He could have argued. He could have demanded respect. But something told him it wouldn't make a difference. So he nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, with quiet dignity, he rose from his seat, adjusted his uniform, and walked toward the door. The last thing he heard before stepping outside was the faint murmur of conversation resuming, as if he had never been there at all. But something was coming. And soon, Mr. Collins would pay the price. As the soldier stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind him, the tension in the restaurant didn't fade. If anything, it grew heavier, like a storm cloud lingering just overhead. Mr. Collins stood frozen behind the counter, his fingers gripping the edge of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breathing was uneven, his jaw clenched. He could still see the soldier's face in his mind, the confusion, the quiet hurt, the way he had straightened his uniform before walking away. For a moment, just a moment, something deep inside him wavered. Then he shook it off. "Get back to work," he snapped at the waitress, his voice sharper than intended. She flinched before quickly retreating toward the kitchen. A few customers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. A man near the window leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Collins, that was harsh. He was just a kid looking for a meal." Mr. Collins' head jerked up, his glare was cold, unwavering. "I don't serve soldiers," he said, his voice carrying finality. "Not now, not ever." The man sighed but didn't push further. He knew better. They all did. Because those who had lived in this town long enough knew that Mr. Collins had his reasons. Decades ago, when he was just a boy, there had been another war, one that had stolen his brother. It was a memory buried deep in his chest, one he refused to unearth. But sometimes, in moments like these, it surfaced whether he wanted it to or not. He had been just 12 when Daniel, his older brother, was drafted. Daniel had been everything to him, the kind of brother who ruffled his hair when he was upset, who sneaked him extra candy when their parents weren't looking. He had promised to come back. He had sworn it. But promises meant nothing in war. Mr. Collins still remembered the day the officer knocked on their door, the way his mother had collapsed to the floor, wailing, his father standing rigid, fists clenched. He had stood there, too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but old enough to feel the loss settle into his bones. Daniel never came home. And from that day forward, something inside young Collins hardened. Over the years, his grief twisted into something else. Bitterness. Soldiers were the reason his brother had been taken. Soldiers were the ones who marched into wars they didn't understand, leaving families shattered in their wake. He hated them. Hated the sight of uniforms, the stiff way they walked, the empty pride in their eyes. So when that soldier walked into his restaurant tonight, looking so young, so much like Daniel had been before he left, Collins' chest had tightened with something too painful to name. But he would never admit that. Instead, he swallowed the lump in his throat and turned toward the kitchen. "We're done talking about this," he muttered. Yet deep inside, something felt wrong. And before the night was over, Mr. Collins would learn that some wounds, especially those fueled by hatred, come with a price. A price he was about to pay. The door shut behind the soldier with a hollow thud. Inside the restaurant, silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. Conversations that had once flowed easily now faltered. Utensils clinked softly against plates, but the warmth that had once filled the small establishment was gone. Mr. Collins turned away, forcing himself to focus on wiping down the counter. He told himself it was over. Just another customer walking out. But deep down, something gnawed at him. The soldier hadn't argued, hadn't raised his voice or caused a scene. He had simply left. And yet, his quiet disappointment had cut deeper than any shouted accusation ever could. Mr. Collins exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He had done the right thing. That soldier, all soldiers, didn't deserve his kindness. And yet, the feeling didn't fade. Minutes passed. The restaurant carried on. But then, a sudden, sharp sound. A crackling noise, faint at first, almost like the rustling of paper. Then the unmistakable scent of smoke. "Do you smell that?" one of the waitresses muttered, frowning. Another second passed, then chaos erupted. Flames. They licked at the walls near the kitchen. Small at first, but growing fast. Someone screamed. Chairs scraped against the floor as customers rushed toward the exit. Panic surged as the fire exploded outward, hungry and relentless. "Get out! Get out now!" one of the cooks shouted. Mr. Collins turned, eyes widening, as he saw flames climbing up the wooden beams. Heat blasted against his skin, and for the first time that night, true fear settled into his chest. "The gas line," a voice shrieked from the kitchen. "It must have." A sudden boom cut them off. The fire surged, swallowing everything in its path. The restaurant was falling apart. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Mr. Collins stumbled back, his vision blurred, his body screaming for oxygen. He needed to get out, now. But then, a wall of flames blocked the exit. The heat was unbearable. His lungs burned. He coughed, staggering toward the back door, but the fire was already there, devouring everything, cutting off every escape. He tried to shout, but the smoke smothered his voice. His vision darkened. Somewhere in the chaos of it all, a thought flickered through his fading consciousness. Was this karma? He had turned a hungry soldier away, had let his hatred win, and now fire was consuming him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the glow of the flames, merciless, final. By the time the fire department arrived, the restaurant was nothing but smoldering ruins. The townspeople stood outside, watching in stunned silence. No one could say for sure what had caused the fire. Some blamed the gas line. Others whispered about fate. But most believed that the bitterness inside Mr. Collins had finally ignited into something he couldn't escape. By morning, the restaurant was nothing more than a heap of charred wood and ashes. The once bustling diner, filled with the hum of conversations and the scent of home-cooked meals, was gone. The town gathered near the smoldering ruins, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of dying embers. The air was thick with the scent of burnt wood and ash, a stark contrast to the once inviting aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering soups that had filled the restaurant. No one spoke at first. They simply stood there, absorbing the scene, the charred remains of tables and chairs, the collapsed beams that once held laughter and conversation. A place that had been a staple of the town was now nothing more than a pile of blackened debris. Then slowly, the whispers began. Some spoke of the tragedy, their voices laced with genuine sorrow. "Such a terrible accident," an elderly woman murmured, shaking her head. "A lifetime of work, gone in minutes." But others weren't so sure it was just an accident. "Minutes," someone else muttered. "Just minutes after he turned that soldier away, this happened." The words sent a shiver through the crowd. It was impossible to ignore the bitter irony. A man who had refused kindness had met his end in a way no one could have predicted. The fire department arrived at sunrise, confirming that a faulty gas line had likely caused the blaze. A tragic but logical explanation. And yet, it didn't stop the unease that settled over the town like an unseen force. Because deep down, some believed there was something more at play. A consequence of cruelty. A moment of reckoning. A force beyond human understanding, making sure that what is given to the world is eventually returned. And as the last flames flickered out, so did the legacy of Mr. Collins. Not remembered for the meals he served, but for the moment he refused. For days, the tragedy hung over the town like a heavy storm cloud, refusing to pass. Conversations were whispered in hushed tones, eyes lingered a little longer on the charred remains of the once beloved restaurant, and an unspoken heaviness settled in the hearts of those who had witnessed the events unfold. People didn't just mourn the loss of the building. They grappled with something deeper, the weight of what had happened before the flames. They replayed the moment in their minds, recalling the way Mr. Collins's voice had been so cold, so final when he had turned the soldier away. They remembered the way the young man had stood there, his posture rigid, his face calm, but his eyes, those quietly pained eyes, had said everything. And just like that, he had left. He never came back. No one saw him in town again. Not at the bus station, not in passing on the streets. It was as if he had vanished into the wind, carrying the weight of that night with him. But even as he continued his service, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into years, he never spoke of it. Not to his fellow soldiers, not in quiet moments of reflection. It was a wound that left no visible scar, but one that he carried deep within, a reminder that pain isn't always loud. Sometimes it settles quietly, unseen, unfelt by others. Yet through it all he found solace in one simple truth. He had kept his dignity. He could have argued, could have let his anger take over. He had every reason to demand respect, to call out the injustice, but he had chosen another path, one that required more strength. He had walked away, head held high, his honor untouched. And in the end, it was not him who had been consumed by resentment. It was Mr. Collins, the man who had spent years feeding others, but had let his own heart starve. The man who had built something from nothing, only to watch it be reduced to ashes, just as bitterness had reduced him. Now when people spoke of him, they didn't talk about the food he once served, the warmth his restaurant used to hold. They spoke of his anger, his hatred, his unwillingness to let go of the past. And the soldier? Though the world would never hear his story in grand speeches or written history, he had won in the way that mattered most. He had walked away unbroken. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment with your thoughts. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories like this to life. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And if you think this story deserves to be heard, please share it with others. Every like, comment, and share helps our channel grow. And we truly appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you for watching.